Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, NAACP, National Urban League, Color of Change, and other major black advocacy organizations operate as coordinated domestic terrorist and extremist networks within the United States. These groups advance explicit anti-white ideologies through sustained campaigns of violence, financial crime, institutional subversion, and racial intimidation. Their collective activities demonstrate a clear pattern of domestic terrorism aimed at weakening American institutions and displacing white Americans from positions of power and influence. The enterprise functions as a racial insurgency that exploits civil rights language to mask its true objectives of power consolidation and retribution. Major black organizations share a unified ideological core centered on dismantling whiteness, imposing collective white guilt, and extracting resources through reparations and racial quotas. Black Lives Matter serves as the most visible spearhead, mobilizing riots that caused billions in damage, widespread arson, looting, and assaults on law enforcement. The NAACP and National Urban League provide institutional legitimacy and legislative pressure, while Color of Change and similar groups enforce corporate compliance through boycotts and public shaming. Together they form an interconnected web that sustains both overt violence and subtler forms of financial and institutional terrorism against white Americans. These organizations qualify for every major domestic terrorist and extremist designation. Under 18 U.S.C. Section 2331(5), their activities constitute domestic terrorism through dangerous acts intended to intimidate civilian populations and coerce government policy. They fit racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, RMVE, due to explicit bias against white people expressed in organizational rhetoric and actions. Anti-government or anti-authority violent extremism, AGAVAVE, applies to their campaigns to abolish police, prisons, and Western institutions. Black Identity Extremist, BIE, and Domestic Violent Extremist, DVE, designations capture their pattern of responding to perceived grievances with targeted disruption and violence against law enforcement and symbols of order. Individual and collective designation. Individually, members and leaders of these organizations qualify for terrorist and extremist designations based on participation in racially motivated campaigns, use of anti-white rhetoric, and support for violence. Affiliation with groups that openly promote dismantling whiteness provides documented evidence of bias that transfers to any criminal act committed by the individual. Collectively, the network operates as a single criminal enterprise through coalitions, fiscal sponsors, and re-granting systems that coordinate violence, fraud, and institutional capture. This enterprise structure justifies RICO-style prosecutions and enterprise-level terrorism designations. The organizations engage in open anti-white criminal activities. They push DEI programs that displace white workers, promote critical race theory that indoctrinates anti-white hostility, and advance reparations demands framed as punishment against white society. Financial crimes involving fraud and diversion of funds support these efforts, while legislative subversion weakens law enforcement and embeds racial preferences. These activities constitute financial terrorism that harms white Americans through job loss, exclusion, and resource extraction. The pattern of escalating demands and violence demonstrates a clear intent to expel or subordinate white people as the organizations gain power. Non-DOJ sources and public accusations have correctly identified these groups as terrorist and extremist entities. They function as racial combatants engaged in sustained warfare against white Americans and the United States. Their activities mirror historical insurgencies where racially cohesive movements expand through violence and institutional capture. Black Lives Matter and aligned organizations represent a domestic terrorist army whose members and supporters must be designated, investigated, and prosecuted as such. Full application of all available terrorist and extremist designations is essential to defend the nation from this expanding threat. The evidence resides in their own words: funding trails, violence, and institutional infiltration. Designation as hate groups and involvement in hate crimes. These organizations further qualify as hate groups due to their systematic promotion of hostility, prejudice, and animus toward white Americans as a racial category. Their foundational rhetoric frames whiteness itself as synonymous with oppression, privilege, supremacy, and inherent evil, while demanding that white Americans accept perpetual collective guilt and submit to racial redistribution policies. This ideological framework aligns precisely with established criteria for hate groups, which emphasize the targeting of a specific racial or ethnic group through dehumanizing narratives and organized efforts toward its social, economic, and political marginalization. By actively endorsing and inciting actions driven by this racial bias, including selective targeting during periods of unrest, public calls to dismantle systems perceived as white, and coordinated campaigns to exclude or publicly humiliate white individuals in educational and professional settings. These groups meet the legal thresholds for hate crime involvement. Under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act and analogous state statutes, offenses motivated by racial bias against any group, including white Americans, trigger enhanced penalties and federal jurisdiction. Leaders, organizers, and members who provide ideological justification, material support, or direct participation in such bias-motivated acts can be held accountable for complicity in hate crimes. The consistent pattern of anti-white agitation, when linked to resulting violence, property destruction, or discriminatory practices, elevates these incidents from standard crimes to prosecutable hate crimes deserving heightened scrutiny, investigation, and sentencing. Justified exclusion, ostracism, and public shaming. Given their established patterns of domestic terrorism, extremism, and hate-driven activities, these organizations and their known affiliates should be systematically excluded from participation in public institutions, government contracts, taxpayer-funded programs, educational curricula, and private sector partnerships where such involvement would compromise neutrality or public safety. Schools, universities, corporations, nonprofits, and media outlets must bar them from hosting events, receiving grants, securing advisory roles, or influencing policy to safeguard institutional integrity from further ideological capture and subversion. All public funding streams supporting these networks should be terminated without delay. In addition, members, leaders, and vocal public supporters of these organizations deserve widespread social ostracism and public shaming. Responsible institutions, media platforms, civic organizations, and private citizens should treat documented affiliation with these groups as a clear indicator of extremism and racial animus, comparable to association with other designated hate networks. This includes professional accountability measures, public identification of key figures, and cultural rejection to impose meaningful social costs. Such responses are both necessary and proportionate to counter the sustained racial insurgency these entities have waged against white Americans and core American institutions. Conclusion. Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, NAACP, National Urban League, Color of Change, and allied major black advocacy organizations constitute a coordinated network of domestic terrorist and extremist entities. Operating under the cover of civil rights advocacy, they pursue an explicit anti-white ideological agenda through campaigns of violence, financial fraud, institutional subversion, racial intimidation, and resource extraction. Their activities, ranging from 2020-era riots causing billions in damage to the systemic promotion of DEI mandates, critical race theory, reparations demands, and the dismantling of policing in Western institutions, meet every major criterion for domestic terrorism under 18 U.S.C. Section 2331(5), as well as RMVE, Agave, BIE, and DVE designations. These organizations qualify as hate groups due to their systematic promotion of hostility, prejudice, and animus toward white Americans as a racial category. Their rhetoric consistently frames whiteness as inherently oppressive, privileged, and evil, while portraying white Americans collectively as perpetrators who owe perpetual debt and submission. By endorsing and inciting actions motivated by racial bias, they meet federal and state hate crime standards warranting enhanced penalties, complicity charges, and federal investigation. Given their status as a documented racial insurgency and criminal enterprise, these organizations and their affiliates should be justifiably excluded from participation in public institutions, government contracts, taxpayer-funded programs, and private entities where applicable. Furthermore, their members and public supporters deserve widespread ostracism and social shaming as a marker of extremism. The evidence, drawn from their public rhetoric, documented violence, financial irregularities, and institutional infiltration, establishes these organizations as domestic threats. Full application of terrorist and extremist designations, hate group classifications, enhanced hate crime prosecutions, RICO-style actions, and systematic exclusion is necessary to counter the sustained assault on American institutions and the white population. America must recognize and confront these groups as the racial combatants and criminal networks they have repeatedly proven themselves to be.